From the Washington Examiner, I'm Siraj Hashmi, and this is Hashing It Out. Today I'm joined by Andrew Heaton, who you're a political commentator, comedian.
Yeah, I'm a comedian who's political.
Okay, so you've focused on politics for how many years now?
Oh, way too many. I think maybe 6 or 7, maybe 8. Let's
Maybe
say 8.
Okay, so
Yeah.
I guess we could both agree that we're somewhat political novices in Washington, D.C.
By Washington, D.C. standards, I have never been a senator and I've never been indicted. So I am indeed a novice by the standards of this town. But if we're doing like, I don't know, Milwaukee standards, I'm like mid-level.
Okay, that's what's up. I respect that. So today's topic, we're talking about tribalism, how Republicans and Democrats just don't seem to be getting along at all, especially in the Trump era. First of all, Andrew, what do most people not understand about tribalism?
You know, I'll tell you as a jumping point what I didn't understand about tribalism, because I'm first and foremost a comedian. And if you go into comedy, what everybody knows pretty quick is that everyone relates to death and sex, right? So even monks fear death to some extent or have had sex or what. Like everybody has, I'm not casting aspersions on Benedictines. I'm just saying all human beings have some relationship with death and sex. We know this within comedy, right? I did not realize going into comedy that tribalism is just as intense, if not more so, than death and sex. So for example, if I'm doing stand-up and I do a joke about either of those topics, right? I'm making a joke about mortality, no one's really gonna get ruffled. But if I start making jokes about like, why do you support the Washington Nationals? Why, like, are all the players are from Washington? No, they're not. Does the owner live here? He lives in New York. People will stab you. Like, people are very, very tribal. It is a deeply, deeply inset part of our fabric, and it can be positive in the sense that it compels us to cooperate with people and to have a sense of community and belonging. Those are all good things. But so much of tribalism, but particularly in politics, where we are right now, is I'm going to love my team because I hate your team. I hate your team, and I'm motivated to get up in the morning and fight your team. And I think that is very unproductive, and it is leading to a very negative mental state for people in the country.
So would you say it's more of being for something or more of being against something?
Against something, yeah. I mean, I think there's a benign form of tribalism, which is the being for something, which so I'm a secular individual. I'm not a part of a religion, but if you're going to your local Methodist church or you're in the Rotary Club, whatever that is, and you've got a sense of community and you've got you feel an obligation to take care of the other people in it. That's a very good thing. So in that form, we can just talk about tribalism in the sense of just community building. That's good. Right. But I think for our purposes, and right now the predominant use of the term tribalism is a negative one, and that is very much steeped on hating another team. And that, I think, is a very bad thing. And when you get into politics and you get into tribalism, I think broadly you can approach it in two different ways. Either politics is problem solving, or it's a game, or it's a job. One of those three things, right? Or it's a religion. And if it's religion, in that case, then whatever your political party is, however you vote, is a manifestation of your spiritual identity. And there's not a lot of room for maneuverability or room for compromise under those situations, because then we're dealing with a zero-sum Manichaean battle between good and evil. And when that happens, I'm also justified in being mean to you, because if you're on the wrong team, you've willfully decided to be evil. And so I'm completely fine to be nasty to you and to do all sorts of things I would never do if you were just, on the other side of a debate in the local Lions Club or something like that, or, in an engineering equation.
So we've sort of seen tribalism, I don't know if it's become more of a topic of conversation, at least in the Trump era. Before, it was probably known as towing the party line. Now, how did this just morph into just straight up tribalism where everybody's against something and yelling at each other?
Yeah, well, I think there's a lot of factors going on. I mean, it's interesting that you bring up towing the party line. That's something that's changed in that we are now at more independent than anything else. I'm an independent. I'm not a Republican or Democrat, and I'm part of about 52% of the country that isn't a member of a party. Now, granted, most of those independents lean a particular direction.
Right.
I think as that's happened, the people that have remained tend to be a lot more intense and a lot more homogenous in their thinking than used to happen. There's a really good political scientist that I'm a fan of named Morris Fiorina over at the Hoover Institute. And he talks about how, weirdly, and this will sound very counterintuitive, we're not actually more polarized than we used to be, but we are much better sorted than we used to be. So when I first came here to Washington, I worked for Blue Dog Democrats, which is to say moderate or conservative Democrats, who I think are all now in hiding on Tatooine or Dagobah. Like they're not around anymore. And prior to them, there was the progressive Republicans, the Rockefeller Republicans. Right. They're gone as well. Roscoe Bartlett, likewise, he's hanging out on Tatooine. Yeah. So as that big sort has happened, where it used to be that you had big tents that could accommodate a lot of ideological viewpoints, as that has narrowed its scope, I think the people in them are becoming more and more monolithic in their thinking. And because it's not a mindset of like, well, I'm a Western Republican a la Barry Goldwater, but I recognize there's Northeast Republicans like, Governor Romney, and then there's all like that kind of thing. That's all kind of narrowed. Mm-hmm. And so it's much easier to castigate people that disagree with you because they're not on your team anymore. Right. I think another thing to go back to the secular thing, and again, I'm saying this as a secular person. I personally think that is kind of traditional religious activity in the United States has declined, that politics is filling that vacuum, which horrifies me because I can't think of a worse supplement for religion than politics. I would much rather people get into Star Trek or pro wrestling. Charity would be pretty cool. That'd be a nice way to spend your time. But I think a lot of the same people that we're meeting now that are really intense and combative and histrionic, a lot of the time the people that are kind of falling into those slots, I think a lot of that energy would have otherwise been going into religion. And they've figured out how to glom onto something that's bigger than them, that has a purpose, that has a transcendental feel to it. But in the case of politics, that religion is a Manichaean religion between good and evil, and that changes the stakes.
Yeah, I can recall back in, I think, the early part of 2017 when Trump was getting inaugurated or sworn into office, there was a poll that showed that most individuals, while seeking in the dating scene, who were trying to seek a significant other or a potential spouse, that they actually care more about the person's politics than they do their religion. Mm-hmm. So that's sort of a indicator now.
And as somebody that was living in New York during that time, as a non-progressive, I can tell you that was very much the case.
Yeah, no, it's fascinating.
I might otherwise have been married. If it were a Clinton administration, it's possible I'd have kids right now.
So moving on, agree or disagree with this statement? Tribalism is a microcosm of our system of winner-take-all politics.
I'm going to say either yes, but, or no, and.
Okay, let's hear the yes, but first.
So the yes, but, I mean, I do think that we have a winner-takes-all system, and that's facilitating all of this. So like, from my vantage point, not saying anything about the members of political parties, but I think the leadership in both the two major political parties are borderline sociopathic in terms of Republicans and Democrats both don't want competitive democracy. They don't want it. That's why we've got gerrymandering. That's why we've got all sorts of ballot access laws that make it incredibly difficult to run as a third party. And whenever you bring up you'll notice that all the talk we're having right now about scrapping the Electoral College, no one ever brings up ranked choice voting, which if anybody's unfamiliar with this, ranked choice voting.
Yeah, explain that.
Let's say in theory you're a big Ron Paul fan. You know he's not going to get certainly this time because he's not running.
Right.
You know that he's not going to take the nomination. And so you're like, I'm going to rank Ron Paul, Bernie Sanders, Huntington, whoever at the top. If they don't get it, then I want this person. I want Gary Johnson. If Gary Johnson doesn't get it, I want Hillary Clinton at the bottom as Trump. However you want to organize that, right? But basically in a ranked choice system, you can't have a spoiler because once the person has been statistically eliminated, it would default to the next biggest choice.
I see.
And as a result of that, you're able to actually put forth your candidate that you would prefer, as opposed to being forced to pick the lesser of two evils. Now, the system we have is very much designed around the lesser of two evils, and I think the Republican and Democratic parties both don't want us to engage in that because it is a lot easier to motivate people to vote based out of fear and hatred than it is to vote based out of good values or problem solving. And if you remove that, that's gone. So I do think that element is factoring into tribalism. The but element is I don't think that it just starts there and scales up. I think that there is a very deep evolutionary evolutionary matrix that's built into all of this that manifests itself in American politics. So can I do a spiel on Dunbar's number?
Let's hear it.
I think this explains so much. So Robin Dunbar is a British sociologist. He's over at Cambridge right now, I think. And he came up with what's called Dunbar's number. So he's started in anthropology, started looking at the brain size of various primates. And he developed an algorithm to determine, based on the brain size, how many members of that species tribe can it have before that tribe splits. So like with chimps, chimp troop sizes, I don't remember the exact figure, let's say it's 50. You can have 50 chimps, and if you get 60 or 70, they'll start fighting, and they'll either split or they'll kill each other until it's down to 50 or 60. If you have gorillas, it's like 20. And for human beings, he used that same algorithm and worked his way out, and he came up with we can have 150 people in our units. And after that, we become abstractions. And I think the easiest way to think of this is 150 people is as big as a group of humans can get before they need name tags. After that, you and I can personally interact. We can interact with our 150-person neighborhood. We get into the range of like 3,000 people. It's harder to picture them as a person. We get into the range of 20, 30,000 people. If a mudslide happens in Kyrgyzstan and 10,000 people die tomorrow, on an abstract level, I know that's bad.
Right.
But on a personal level, I would be, I don't like this. I would be personally more emotionally disturbed if your dog died because I know you.
Right.
But I don't know any of those people. They're numbers, right? We have this built-in limit to how many people we can perceive as being human at any given time, and we're up against that. We also have 7 billion people on the planet.
Right.
So one of the workarounds we've come up with that is to kind of unite these 150 unit people into a bigger tribe, usually through some kind of mythology or some kind of belief system, and to a large extent by hating another team. So when there's nothing going on, that kind of breaks down, and it's like I don't know what's going on. But now suddenly the Russians pop up, or the Chinese pop up, or the Klingons. It doesn't really matter who it is. When they come in, all of a sudden you and I are on the same team again. It doesn't matter that we don't necessarily have that connection, but we know we're at least fighting those guys.
Right.
I think that Dunbar's number and the idea that we have a built-in limit to how many people we can emotionally perceive as human at any given time is the kind of psychological equivalent of like E equals MC squared. It's a really, really important figure, and I think that factors into American politics very much.
Yeah, you bring up an interesting point. You ever watch the show, or not show, you ever seen the movie Watchmen?
I saw the movie, yes.
Yeah, so I haven't seen the show, but the movie, Watchmen, for those who are not familiar, centers around some basically washed up superheroes who are kind of defunct, and there's an omnipotent, all-powerful being called Dr. Manhattan.
Right, yeah.
And
the blue guy.
The blue guy, the giant blue guy who can, and then they find out the villain is one of the members of the superhero team, Ozymandias. And for those, it's been 10 years since the movie came out, so I feel like we could talk about spoilers. Essentially, in the climax of the movie is that Ozymandias sort of creates a particular device that detonates inside both the United States and Russia during the Cold War to basically frame Dr. Manhattan, who doesn't need humans anyway. And in doing so, he unites the United States and Russia together, basically ending the Cold War against a common enemy being Dr. Manhattan, which is kind of an interesting way of doing it. As soon as you talk about while we cannot see, say, like outside the 150 person threshold of people being human, all of a sudden you bring that humanity involved.
We experience unity and community more viscerally when there's an other that it's pitted against.
Right.
It's a lot like I think it's an Albanian saying, me against my brother and I against our cousins, my cousins and I against the world. Mm-hmm. I think that's a very real thing. And right now, if SETI were to uncover an alien civilization, benignly broadcasting sitcoms towards us, I think you would see a global shift of like, well, I disagree with the Chinese, but they only got one head. Like you'd see that phenomenon,
right?
And that definitely is. I think in American politics, like, look at the periods that are most kumbaya in American history, where people would say things like, I disagree with the Democrats, but by God, we're all Americans, and we have to stand, toe to toe. And it tends to be when we're at war,
right?
Like within my lifetime. The high watermark was probably about a week after 9/11, where Rudy Giuliani is America's mayor, and George W. Bush is shooting up in the polls. And we go back to the Cold War, which was probably an aberration because it went on so long because we didn't actually have the shooting match. You were able to have a sense of, all right, we're going to fight like cats and dogs domestically, but when we get to the water, this all stops because we have a much bigger threat.
Right.
The Soviet Union is an external threat. I think absent that, we've basically turned on each other, where we're like, well, I don't have the Soviet Union to hate anymore. I guess I hate you.
Yeah.
I hate you now because I have to hate somebody.
Yeah.
Not hating someone's not an option.
Right. So, in your mind, do you think tribalism is more about, say, loyalty to a particular ideology, or is it more loyalty to a particular public figure, a politician or a person?
Neither. I think it's loyalty to the group, it can be either one that animates them. I mean, I think Trump's an interesting dichotomy in that thing, in that Trump, to me, I see very little evidence of an ideological motivation on his part. I would not describe Trump as an ideologue.
Right.
And so you've got, say, in prior examples, like both Trump or Obama have kind of a cult-like figure with their supporters. You get to you get to George W. Bush, probably more ideology. But I think all of that has more to do with signifying your allegiance to a group than it does to a particular element of that group. The group itself is what's important. For our purposes, what I see as more informative is what's going to get people riled up is actually language.
Rhetoric.
Yeah. How you choose to communicate, knowingly or unknowingly, is tipping the deck constantly as to what part of tribe you are. And there's an evolutionary background for this. So if we were to go back, we think our species is like 300,000 years old. We keep adding time. We thought it was 200,000 years till about a month ago. Now it's 300,000 years. If we were to go back in time 200,000 years ago, it would not be super beneficial for you and me and our little tribe of 80 campers to be able to rapidly communicate with a different tribe. It would be because trade is not as much of a thing back then. It would be very important for us to be able to know if it's another tribe coming over the hill or not, because they're probably going to kill us if they're the wrong tribe. And that's probably why language mutates, because it mutates very rapidly. You see this generationally. You see this between Australian and English and American. Language is constantly a signifier as to what team you're on. And you see this all the time in American politics. And I think it explains part of the reason people will oftentimes get angry at you, even when you're agreeing with them. So let's say we'll pick, I don't know, climate change, for example, okay? Let's say, I'm going to give two, forget the policy recommendation. That's not important, but I'm going to use language to illustrate my point here. If I were talking to somebody and I went, I grew up in a traditional household with a patriotic neighborhood, and we believed that we were stewards of God's planet, and I think it's so important that we take responsibility for caring for our planet, and that's why I think a carbon tax is the best way to do that. You know probably how I vote based on that statement. Now, conversely, if I said, science has proven that climate change is happening, and I think it's incredibly privileged to not do something about it because you can, and I think everybody should go watch Hamilton. You probably have a good guess as to what team I'm on.
Right.
So people are constantly doing that, and if you're say libertarian, which I put as a third category, you'd probably mention Firefly, or you'd say something about markets, right?
Right.
So that's happening all the time. I think language really informs that. There's a really interesting political thinker. His name's Arnold Kling, and Arnold Kling wrote a great book extolling these three languages. And what he figured out was that there's sort of three axes that people are communicating along. Or I'm sorry, there's progressives, conservatives, and libertarians are constantly communicating along three axes, most of which don't know they're doing it. If you're a progressive, chances are you are interpreting all the political news stories you're hearing in terms of victim and oppressor. And if you watch MSNBC, you'll see that. And if it doesn't really fit into that matrix, something about it's off. So every situation, there's the little guy and the guy doing the stepping, right? If you're a conservative, the spectrum tends to be civilization versus barbarism, or civilization versus entropy. So you're understanding things more and talking about things more in terms of, this is a threat to our society.
Chaos.
Yeah, it might be chaos, because if we, let's say, if we don't give proper respect to police officers are what's keeping order in society, and if we get rid of the police officers, everything will turn into chaos. It might be outsiders, like an invasion or migrants coming in, or it might be entropy. It might just be kind of a moral failure that's happening, and that's going to lead to it. If you're libertarian, you're going to view things more in terms of, is this coerced or voluntary? Which is why, like, a lot of stories won't register with libertarian, right? So like, do you remember the United flight where they beat the hell out of that guy that wanted to stay on the flight? This is like 2 years ago now.
Was this the same year as Kendall Jenner giving the Pepsi cans out?
I think so.
Yeah.
It was a very filling
around
year.
the same time.
But like when that story came out, like that really lit up with progressives. They understood that instinctively. But like a lot of libertarians were like, well, like was the guy that beat the hell out of him a cop, or was it a private? Was this a private contract, or was this a public thing? Like who was paying the bills here? Because libertarians are really predominantly concerned about force.
Right.
And as a result of that, we're using language constantly to tip ourselves off, and I think that really plays into what rankles people, and ultimately I think it's just we have a very deep instinctive desire to be a part of a group, to constantly affirm that I'm a part of this group, and also to naysay the other group to prove my loyalty. Which is why if you're real chummy with people that aren't a part of your political team, a lot of people call you a traitor, because they
or cuck.
Or a cuck. Because what you're supposed to be doing is you're supposed to be coming out and constantly saying these people are feckless morons, and doing it. And you see this on Twitter all the time. I have a lot of comedian friends that have just quit doing jokes. They've just all they do now is just kind of Craigslist punditry, and it's
the easy stuff that gets retweets and likes.
If it's just even if I agree, but if it's just like Democrats are stupid or Trump is stupid or whatever, there's a mechanism there of like, everybody catch me saying that about the enemy team? Everybody get that? Okay, we all know I'm a good standing member of my team.
That virtue signaling type of stuff. So let's get into civility a little bit, just because there have been constant thick pieces and columns about people writing about the value of civility, and it seems to have withered away. First of all, are the days of civility over?
I don't think so. I don't think that the current emotional state we're in is sustainable. And I'll also say I think it might be slightly overblown. You and I work in media, so we live in this.
Right.
And unfortunately we're forced to be on Twitter regularly. I hung out in Portland, Oregon last week, which is a very progressive city. No one ever brought up politics the whole time. I think I had one conversation, basically kind of what you and I are talking about with heuristics, right? And then, conversely, I was in Oklahoma for Thanksgiving. I think that for much of the country that's not plugged into political media, they're not experiencing this day-to-day fight that you and I are.
Right.
So I think to a great extent it's somewhat isolated. But for those of us that are in it, I think a few things will either happen, and I don't know which one of these scenarios is most likely or is the best analysis. I hate to say this, there'll probably be a war at some point, and we'll come together then. I'm not rooting for that to happen. I hope.
Oh, you mean a war with a foreign nation, not a civil war?
No, well, that's another possibility.
That's another possibility.
I would rank it higher that we will go to war with another country, that we will, we'll go to war with Iran or something like that.
You don't think that though it would be a similar sentiment, say, in this country as to like Vietnam or the 2003 Iraq War, that kind of, even though there were, the Afghanistan War, I think Americans probably, most of them would agree that was a fair and just war in the beginning. Obviously, 19 years later, we're still there. So obviously that had withered away.
A couple of things. So to be very, very clear on this, I am not advocating for war in order to try and make friends across the aisle. That is not nor am I saying that wanton warfare is a good policy. In fact, quite the opposite. I think that's a possibility. I think there's just a propensity to burn out, where people will get worn out. I think most Americans actually have already reached this point, where if you're just at a random barbecue and pick a state, I think they're already largely there. It's going to gear up over 2020, but I've done a lot of traveling this year, and I don't think the rest of the country is quite where we are. I think you can also look at isolated examples here. Imagine you take social media out of your life. All of a sudden it seems way more civil to me. All of a sudden, if social media weren't a factor here, I would be like, no, people are pretty cool. There's going to be the odd person that wants to throw a brick at you, but for the most part, most people are like, how'd you vote? Oh, God, that's wrong. Do you want more brisket? Like, that's where I think most people are. And then the other thing, too, is like, at some point there will be there'll be a pendulum that'll swish politically, where next election it could be the Democrats elected, or it could be the one after that. I do think there is something to the maxim that conservatives tend to view progressives as wrong. Progressives are more apt to see conservatives as evil. I do think there's something to that. I don't think it's across the board, but it's there. So it could be that it's a little bit easier when there's a Democrat in office. And I'll add to that, because that sounds like I'm being mean to progressives here. I think Trump is kind of sui generis, and that I think we have a very, very different environment under President Trump than we would have had under President Romney.
Right.
I think if President Romney were in it, the stakes would seem lower, and the fault lines in the culture between progressives and conservatives and other would be much less in stark relief.
Yeah, just think about it. If Romney had won in 2012, 2020 would be all about replacing a two-term Romney.
That's right. Right now, we'd be having we'd be having the Democratic field versus like Huntington or Rand or something. I don't know what it would be. I guess Pence. Yeah.
Yeah, but so you don't think the days of civility are over, but who do you think is primarily responsible for at least making a bulk of society question whether it is?
I think you're leading me into a trap.
Well, no, I'm interested because I think that's a two-pronged answer, because
Sure.
I don't think one side is primarily responsible for it.
Yeah, well, actually, that's a very good question. I don't think, I'll say very bluntly, I don't think that it's team left or team right. That's the problem. I don't think that there's like a civil team and an uncivil team. And I think it's a very harmful way to look at the American electorate as monolithic in any form. There's also a psychological tendency to view whatever group we're a part of as being very diverse, or rather to understand the diversity of whatever team we're a part of, intellectually or otherwise, and to view the other team as more homogenous. That's just, everybody operates that way, which I think is both false and kind of dangerous. So were we to castigate Democrats as the uncivil team, or Republicans as the uncivil team, or whatever, I don't think it would be too blunt to be really accurate. I think a better way of looking at it is that there's a bunch of different groups, and in fact, I hesitate to even use the left-right spectrum because I don't feel like I'm really on it, to be honest with you. I think I'm a different thing. But if you were to look at the Republican to Democratic Party, in my mind, there's a very big difference between a guy enthusiastically wearing a red hat, a guy that kind of held his nose and voted for Trump, and a Republican that didn't vote for Trump at all, in the same way that I think that there's a very big difference between like all of the 8 John Hickenlooper fans on the Democratic Party, or however you want to phrase the moderates, versus kind of old school class warfare guys like Bernie versus like political activists. And we're in an odd time right now where the loud people are the minority in the country. And there's loud people on either sides, right? There's very loud people at Trump rallies. There's very loud people at political protests. And there's a whole bunch of people in the middle that are just exhausted.
Right, silent majority.
I call it the exhausted majority.
The exhausted majority, that's perfect.
Of which I'm a part. So that's there. I think the root problem, in my mind, I think it is a form of fundamentalism. We know what religious fundamentalism looks like, right? Like back in the 80s and the 90s, the religious fundamentalists were the moral majority and the Christian right and that kind of thing. I think that psychological profile is something that goes beyond official religion to any category. So I have met fundamentalist progressives. My background is more libertarian. I've met libertarian fundamentalists, and I'd say a fundamentalist is someone who 100% believes whatever they believe and are very bothered that you don't believe it. And if you believe it but you don't 100% believe it, that also bothers them. And if you don't reach those two criteria, they want to squash you. And that, I think, is the problem that we're experiencing right now, is that psychological matrix of fundamentalism. But fortunately, I don't think it's the majority.
You mentioned social media earlier and its role sort of in making people more conscious about others' political decisions or their political beliefs. How has it impacted society, you think, overall? I mean, there have been good things, obviously, that come from social media, but politically speaking, I think most people would agree that it hasn't been great.
I would say I think it's been abysmal. I think social media is great if you're coordinating flood relief or the Iranian Revolution. Outside of those two things, I don't see a lot of benefit to it. I'm glad Facebook exists. Like I used to live in Scotland. I've got a bunch of friends. We stay in contact through
Right.
Facebook. I'm able to see what my cousins are up to, that kind of thing. So there's benefits to it. Yeah, I'd say overall politically though, I think it's abysmal. I don't think you and I would fight anyway. But were we to get into an argument, we could hear each other personally a lot easier, and I could see what's going on with your face. Well, it doesn't seem to be finding me online. You can't quite read that. Right. There's also this weird tendency we have as people to where there are things you would say online you would never say in person. You would never ever do that in person, but for some reason whatever part of our brain knows to censor ourselves doesn't register with a glass square of sadness. Right. That does not kick in, and then I think that there's also like a sort of warping effect too, where if you look at Twitter, people on Twitter tend to be more political, so they're misrepresenting the bulk of the population, overall, I don't think social media's been great. For 2019, maybe I'm going to hate this because I haven't done the calculation yet, but I put on my Twitter that I'm going to donate $1 to charity for every political tweet I make, because I think it would, like literally, I think we would solve a third of the problems in the entire country if before you ever tweeted some obnoxious thing about politics, you agreed to donate $1 to charity first.
So are you saying you're against donating to charity?
No, I'm quite the opposite. What I'm saying is whatever you think you're accomplishing on social media, I think would always be, any tweet you make, I think is worth less than $1 you can give to charity. I would far rather you donate $30 to charity than tweet 30, quippy things about whatever team you don't like. I don't think that does anything.
So, everybody's talked about like this idea of the new normal that we're living in, particularly in the Trump era. Do you think, though, and obviously there's no possibility, or it's completely impossible to get back to the days before Trump. Like people will always remember what had happened under the Trump era, or they'll forget because there's just been too much news. But is there going to be a time, you think, in the future on the horizon where people just aren't constantly yelling and screaming at each other 24/7?
Yeah, I don't think it's sustainable. I think that there will always, let me rephrase this, there will always be people that are always screaming. Mm-hmm. I think life is inherently stressful, and I think we've all met people that handle that by, I got cut off in traffic, and my gas bill's due, and all that stuff. And so what do? They hop on social media to find something to anger them so that they can spout off as a form of catharsis. That's not going to go away, because that's, to be blunt, an emotional problem more than a political setting. But I think overall, I think the kind of the general timbre we're feeling, I think will eventually, something will happen. I don't think this is a good resting place. I think either people will get off social media, or there'll be a social media form that is more palatable, where like some alternative to Twitter or Facebook hitherto.
4chan. Yeah.
Exactly, 4chan. Yeah. Well, no, there's actually Hong Kong, which is probably not a great example.
No,
for
probably
politics
not.
But they're working on a service that would sort of. I think your team would kind of whatever kind of pick a given issue, your group would. Figure out the best response, and then they'd sort of figure out, and then there's like polls like, well, what do you care more about? Do you care more about roads? Do you care more about taxes? Things like that. There might be some way to do that, but overall, though, no, I don't. I think this is my prediction. I think it's going to get worse before it gets better, but it will get better. Okay. I don't think the current kind of brittle fear that someone's going to punch you in a bar kind of feeling is going to be there forever. I don't think that'll be there forever.
Andrew Heaton, you're a political commentator, comedian. Can be found on Twitter at Mighty Heaton.
Well, actually, can I do one better?
Absolutely.
I host a funny, non-tribal podcast called The Political Orphanage. So if anything I said resonated with you, and you want to hear funny people not be tribal, go to The Political Orphanage. You'll be able to hear more of me.
Putting the plug on the podcast for your podcast.
Yep.
That's bold moves. Andrew Heaton, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you.
That's our show for today. Subscribe to our podcast on whichever podcast app you're using, whether it be Apple, Spotify, Ricochet, Stitcher, or anything you're using. You can go to our website, WashingtonExaminer.com. Follow us on Facebook or Twitter at DC Examiner. You can also follow me on there. I'm at Siraj Hashmi. And feel free to tell your family and friends about the show. You can also tell them about his podcast as well, Political Orphanage. Special thanks to everyone who's involved in the creation of this podcast, from the Washington Examiner team, my family and friends, and to you, the listener, for being a part of the journey. For the Washington Examiner, I'm Siraj Hashmi, and this is Hashing It Out.